Testing. Has it got a pointer?
Yes, it does have a pointer. The button, it should be already on. The button there, the green one is the pointer. Yeah, the councillor's happy for us.
Okay, so... Oh, that does work on the screen. I'm just going to be careful not to take out your eyes, don't I? Okay, how's that for volume?
All right, councillors, we're nearly ready. Two apologies I know of, Bruce and Anna. Ashley, did someone say Ashley's an apology or not? No. Their team made the grand final on the cricket for 2 weeks' time, so he might be hungover, I'm not sure. No, I'm sure he's fine. So we got those. So Ashley might turn up as we go. All right, so we're good.
Okay, and thank you for inviting me here. And I don't know if you have, but I would like to acknowledge the traditional people of the land we meet on today. And I do bear in mind as I go around the country the rich history of connection with the land. I pay my respects to any elders past, present and emerging in the room, or who might be listening to this. So this is a quick, probably about a 10-minute quick introduction to some of the principles underlying disaster recovery. It's not rocket science, and a lot of what's there you'll say, well, that's fairly self-evident. What this does is give us a framework, a way of explaining it and planning around it and how we deal with communities. And the very first thing I'll flag to you, there's a couple of key concepts in this, and one is that we look at the world of emergency management not through the fires or the floods or what's shaking or what's burning, what's blowing, but rather the impacts. And that's what the lens for everything we consider. If it's a volcano on an uninhabited island in the middle of the Pacific, there's not a lot of impacts that we have to worry about. If it affects vulnerable people or vulnerable economies or environments, that's what we're looking at. So the first thing I'll share with you is the notion that we break those impacts up into 4 broad areas. And you've got this thing up here on the screen or in front of you, and it's often referred to as the propeller diagram. Now, the obvious thing that we jump to, everyone tends to jump to, is the bricks and mortar stuff, the things that have visibly fallen down, been burnt down, blown away, washed away, etc. The bricks and mortar. And that's things like your power, as it says there, water, buildings, bridges, roads, all those physical things. But there's 3 other areas we look at, and they're all interrelated. So on the bottom left, we've got the natural environment, which is our air, water, soil, biodiversity, and so on. And this underpins our agriculture. It underpins our quality of life. When you think about air and water, it's pretty basic. The ecosystems out there, recreation, tourism, it has implications right across the board. The next one around on the bottom right is the economic environment, and it's likewise interdependent with the infrastructure. So the transport mechanisms, our communications, power, all those things are dependent, have an interdependency with our economy, as does the natural resources. And then the 4th one up on the top right is our communities. And without strong connected communities, our local economy doesn't work. And they have a strong interrelationship with the natural resources and obviously rely on the infrastructure. So all 4 of these, whilst they are separate areas that we might plan around, and you've got these 4 subcommittees of your Regional Recovery Committee looking into these areas, that makes up the whole. So that's one area. And at the end of this, I've got some examples from your 2018 consultation further inland of the sort of things that came up grouped that way. Right, second area I'll look at is, PPRR. This is a world of acronyms. Prevent, prepare, respond and recover. And in broad terms, that is that before the event, we try and reduce the risk. And we do that by trying to prevent where possible, fuel management, so on, flood levees, building our houses so that they have bushfire attack levels, that sort of thing. We build capacity, so we have emergency agencies, we have fire trucks and things like that. So that's the capacity to deal with the hazard. But we also, beforehand, we build resilience. And resilience is our ability to take a hit and bend back, to deal with what comes up, because we cannot prevent everything. There's no way we can effectively limit all fuel and prevent fires happening. We can't stop storms happening. We can't stop earthquakes having impacts. And we do the resilience at the household level, at the community level, at the government level, with our infrastructure right across the board. But then when it does happen, there's the world of response. And again, you'll see there that I've broken that into two things. We manage the hazard impacts. Our fire service is there to help us reduce the impact of the fire on our infrastructure, on our natural environment, on our economy, and on our people. But we also need to address the immediate human needs. And that's, if anyone's familiar back with the days of Maslow at school or social work, it's the bottom end of that. It's day-to-day survival stuff. And that's what we're doing in evacuation centres. Making sure that people can get through a day-to-day survival with an adequate quality of life in terms of they've got a roof over their head, they are clothed, they are fed, and they are kept safe and feeling secure. But then afterwards, once we get past that phase, we're into recovery. And that's the awkward, messy, complex one that comes back to all those four areas I talked about. And in particular, you'll see I've highlighted there, it's supporting decision making, because people's ability to make decisions have been really strongly affected. Building social connections, which have all been torn apart by the disruption of the event. And helping people feel more secure. In every disaster I've worked through with a community, probably about at least half of the things they end up deciding, indicating are important for them or they want to do as part of their recovery, is related not so much about putting things back, it's about feeling more secure and facing future events. Now, traditionally this was done as a circular sequence where you would prevent and then you'd prepare and then you'd respond and afterwards you'd recover, and that would roll back into recovery. But we've found that with experience it's much more nuanced and there's a whole heap of complex interrelationships. So you have that presentation there and you can see there how some of them fit neatly into one of those areas, but some really cross over into the lot. And that's the, really this is the challenge of what you as a council are steering and providing leadership for with your community over the next 12 to 24 months in particular, is trying to make sense of that. And that's why it's great that you've got Joe McGoldrick employed here, someone who can get their head into this space and try and make sense of it for you and make sense of it for communities. Another point to share with you is the notion that distress is not just the people who have the fire come up to their front door. And what we find is that if you experience a threat, whether it happens or not, if you perceive the threat or you experience loss, you are at risk of being distressed. And so that what it means is that anybody in your community, no matter how far from the fire front or the floodwaters, could have been impacted by this, and that's a factor affecting all of those areas I mentioned at the start. It's going to flow through into community health, into community interactions. It will have an effect on local economies and so on. It could be anyone in this room. It could be someone, a good example is people who've come back who's had war experience and suddenly they've got choppers hovering over their head. Or they might have had an experience 20 years ago involving a fire. I remember the first time I experienced this, I was in a remote community that didn't actually get burnt, but they had over 3 times in the course of the fire season, they had the fires come up close to their town, which only had one way out. And a year later, I was talking to this person and said, you know, the other day I saw smoke on the horizon and I felt my chest went tight, my heart started pounding, I started sweating, and I was a mess. It was on the horizon. And yet they didn't actually lose their house, but they lived in fear of dying. So that's that concept. In terms of what we try and do about it, this is the model of what we try and do in evacuation centres, but it really underpins a lot of things. down the left-hand side, you can see that people may experience loss, disruption or distress. And what we aim to do with our evacuation centres, with our support services, and even now, is where they've experienced loss. We don't try and fix it for them. We try and help them to identify what they've lost that matters to them, what's missing out of their life, what's changed, and connect them with the resources they can use their own inner strengths to go and access those resources and support their own recovery. For the disruption, that leads to uncertainty, and human beings, we do not cope with uncertainty very well, and we tend to be very afraid of it. So the best thing we can do to deal with a person's uncertainty and disruption is to connect them with information. And again, you'll notice the language here. It's connect them so they can deal with it themselves. And the other thing is that for the distress, the best thing we can do is to connect them with other human beings so that they end up feeling that they're not facing it alone. And that's where we use psychological first aid to provide a supportive environment. And we use that as the glue or the matrix to connect them to the resources and the information. All right, this one here, the roller coaster ride. What we find, if you look up the top of that diagram at on the left, we've got the heroic phase, and this is where we all band together. And I used the example the other day, it's like the brother and sister who are constantly at each other, like cats and dogs. They fight each other, tooth and nail, all the time. But the moment anyone external threatens one of them, suddenly they are thick as and repel all borders. And this is what happens in a community. You'll get the dreadlocked greenie with the forester side by side fighting the fire or helping save a neighbour. Everything's put aside and we have this heroic sense of camaraderie. It's like an incredible sugar hit of togetherness for a community. And for a little while afterwards, and typically for the first couple of days after the main hazard has passed, we're all basking in that afterglow. But just like too much sugar or too much coffee, sooner or later we have to come down off it. And that's that curve that drops down there. And this is where you will find, and it's particularly relevant for you as leaders in your community, that this is where you get blame and arguments. And that's a part of recovery. What we find is I could ask you now, did you have any differences of opinion in your community before the fires and floods? Every community has it. Well, we put that aside, but afterwards we've had our patience tested, we've been stressed, we're tired, we're fatigued, we've got new problems. Are we going to be better able to deal with that or worse? And it's human nature too to look to blame. And so this is the leadership opportunity for us, is how can we help steer communities through this and deal with that and get through the frustration with the red tape and the delays and all these other things. And you will notice there on the timeline that first phase, we might be talking about a matter of days to get to that honeymoon period. But this trough and the climbing back out again at the other side, that can be 1 to 3 years typically. And that is one of the key things I wanted to share with you today, is as a journey for you as a municipality and as a council, you're facing a couple of years of this. We find quite often that it's about the 18-month point that you get spikes in domestic violence, alcohol and other drug issues, suicides. That's when people have they've run out of resources, they've hit the wall, and everybody around them seems to be getting on with it. Even now, parts of your bush are regenerating, and give it 12 months and there's some parts where the world just looks like it's getting on normally. So just a heads up, this is a long journey. And the other aspect of that, just to finish up on this, is that I talked about the tea tree, the resilience, or it's like that thing like a bowling ball with a bowling pin with a weight in the bottom that you could punch it and it would flop over and then it would bounce back up again. That's resilience, and that's what most people are like. And most people, if you provide the right supportive environment, they don't need fixing, they definitely do not need counselling. That will actually hurt the process because they start seeing themselves as victims. Treated with support, you typically get that brown line there, which is the resilient one. So the person, they take a hit, our functioning decreases, but we spring back up again and we come back up to a new level of functioning, a new normal. It won't be the same. We can't wind the clock back, but it'll be this brown point, which is where we want our community to be collectively, is where people are no longer living a life which is defined by the event. Their life is no longer defined by the reconstruction and adjusting and everything else. They get up in the morning and they just do their life without thinking about it and without having to adjust. There are some people, and so for them you do not want counselling. The aqua line at the bottom there is the person who does need the clinical intervention. They're the person who they take a hit and for whatever reason their own inner strengths are not enough to get them back up again. They need the social worker or the counsellor. But it's maybe only about 1 in 10, something like that, in a well-functioning community where we can support people. There's also the yellow line is the delayed. And this is where you get someone who, they hold it together. They struggle on, and this happened to me once when a family crisis, I had 2 young kids. My partner was critically ill. I had to keep it going. 6 months later, I did that yellow thing and I fell apart. That's when I needed help. So just a heads up that we've got this coming through in our community, further down the track. And the other 2, the resistant, sometimes you get someone who they've dealt with so many things over their life, they're just so used to it. Oh, yeah. Well, and now you'll find that with some of your floods because you've got a history of flooding and people are used to it, they've got organised and they say, oh yeah, you call that a flood. You know, it's like Paul Hogan and the knife. Yeah, give me a real one. But you might find to give them a fire and they're different. And then there's the rare person, it's reasonably uncommon, where it's actually a growth opportunity, where they learn new skills out of this, they get they become leaders in their community. Or the example of someone who came up to a colleague of mine after a talk like this and said, you know, I'm embarrassed to say it, but that was me. I was in an abusive relationship, and when our house burnt down, it enabled me to separate and move into town and start a new life. But I'm so racked with guilt because people died for me to come on. So that's one of the other. So this is the mixture of people in your community. And I think that brings me just to back when you did your community consultation in 2018, I had a look at some of that document, and you can see that some of the things the community back there was saying that they wanted to do, this is before the fire, but they do fit into those 4 areas. So it's a useful construct to think around and plan around how we help people deal with the impacts of the fires. And I think I've kept this really as quick as I could. Brings me to questions. All stunned faces. Yeah.
Just there. So, I'll go back another one. Sorry. So if money and resources flow earlier, past that honeymoon period, can you actually prevent that trough?
You can reduce it. It's not the level of money, it's the way it's used, in my experience. The first community I worked with, we went out and deliberately tried to pick out very quickly what are the no-brainer simple things we can get happening, which gives visible progress out there to the community, while we put aside the thornier ones which would take more work to work through. So we picked out the things that were universally supported, that didn't need much planning, which would give a visible result. So weren't processed or something in the back of nowhere. And I think a good example is your cleanup. If that could have happened quicker, then people get that visual sign of things are moving. It's not the amount of money, it's how you spend it, in my personal view. Sorry, can you Hit your mic.
Yeah, a lot of them are surviving from people coming up and doing relief work, helping fencing and stuff like that. The ones that I suppose have been up there and quite resilient for many years, dealing with floods and droughts and fires and everything that goes with it. And then on the other hand, we've just got families that are living up there, who are just sort of they're not necessarily working on the land. They're living in possibly bush environment or a country environment. Kids going to the local school and stuff. What do you think, or who do you think is hit the most, as in the looking forward, what this trough's going to be like for us? Is the trough going to be worse, do you think, for the working people who then are going to struggle to find an income, or for the families who are going to struggle to find a family base again from where their houses have been burnt down?
There's no one universal answer. I would suggest it's the people who have a sense of purpose. So the person who is working, particularly if they're working the farm, if they can see they've got a way of keeping that farm going, they have hope. Hope is the process of, I use the analogy, it's like you're standing on a stairwell in a multi-story building, and down is bad and up is good. And hope is realizing that if I keep walking up those stairs to my left, every step will get me closer to being out of here. It will. So that's the expectation that the world, that life could be better than it is today. That's hope. Despair is where I feel I don't like where I am now, and I cannot see any reasonable prediction that it will get better. And if anything, the more time I take, it takes me one step further down the stairs, and that's despair. And that's the feeling of hopelessness. So with your question, if that family has connections to other families that they can get moral and psychological support from, they can see that there is a process that they might be able to get a house out of this eventually, even if it's a long journey. If they can have an expectation that there's a better future, they're more likely to get through. So in the example you gave there could be some of those farms that are facing despair. Some of those remote families are facing despair. Others, if they can see, well, okay, I have very little, but I don't have a mortgage, and I can see that I'm going to have a roof over my head, we've got each other. And it comes back to the resilience and the people. Some people, if they've got that more optimistic sense of, well, we will get through this. And notice I use the word we, because if ever they're thinking I, they're more at risk. If they're talking we, now it could be as a family, or it could be, I know we've got quite a few in some areas up and down the coast. We've got older men who are living alone in shanties up in the hills. And some of them, and they often choose to be that way, but it means that they are more at risk because they may not have connections. But it's not all of them. We can't typecast anyone. I think it's a very astute question, and I'd say it could be either, because some of those farmers have been through so much drought that their debt levels are going to be so bad, they've destocked and everything else. It comes back to that sense of, can they see a worthwhile future, and what can we do to help them either understand their options or connect them to the resources? But it needs to be about, how do we empower them to make those decisions themselves, to access those resources themselves, and to make it their own journey.
I suppose I asked that question in that way because, like, our farmers have been dealing with the drought, and then along from the drought comes the fires, and so they're sort of copping a double hit. And then what I've been speaking to quite a few of them up there, then the media starts, with their broadcasting of what's happening. The Prime Minister says there's funding available and we're going to get it to you early as we can and quick as we can, and then there's that period here in your troughs and highs where it seems like a straight line that goes down, because the talk of the funding availability and the actual seeing the funding turn up might be just clearing the burnt out house that they don't have to look at every day. It's Yeah, I see it a very hard one that the whole thing is handled as good as it could, I suppose, but you know, like not together
Yeah,
like when it started out.
and I'm not making excuses, but that's fairly inevitable for something so far out of scale, out of
Yeah.
past experience. And that's not to condone the performance. It's just what it is.
Yeah.
One thing to also mention is that I think the people who are at greatest risk is, or one area where greatest risk is the people around the edges of eligibility. And that's where you've got one of our people, Chantel, working here, and she's able to do the follow-up for the people who are not a straightforward case of eligible, and try and do the extra miles to work out, well, if you don't fit that, what else can we access for you? And again, it's that feeling of, okay, I'm not facing this alone. There's somebody here who's got my back, who's going to go that extra mile for me, who'll try and find something and connect them to whatever it can be. It's the people around the edges that are at greater risk of what you describe.
Yeah.
The obvious person who's eligible, well, they get something, and a big event like this, it can be a reasonable amount of support. The other area you've got a potential big problem is the underinsured. There's quite a lot of support being put in place for the people at the most extreme end of lack of resources. So the uninsured with below Centrelink asset level, there are safety nets for them. The people who are well insured can potentially come out of this quite well, but the people who have underinsurance could potentially have large amounts of debt added to their life and be excluded from a lot of the official support because they have insurance. And I think that's one of the big question areas.
It's an interesting thing, and I don't mean to get off the point at all, but I know when you go to insure your car, you know, there's always a book value, you know, there's always a retail value. And it seems to me that house insurance should be the same. I know that's going off the track a bit, you know, but people who live up there, I know that they've had lots of houses up there with asbestos. So the rebuilding amount of money that they have, that they're insured for, half of that will be gone just by clearing the asbestos.
Or more.
Yeah, the clearing's
very
actually covered by the state government.
It's covered by the state, yeah?
Yes,
Okay.
but there's a risk for the future, because I go back to that PPRR, the before, during and after.
Yeah.
Just think of the amount of properties you have in this municipality who have old fibro or other asbestos in their property, who could be up for an $80,000 to $150,000 cleanup bill that their insurance may not cover if they have a house fire, or even if they have a small fire that's below the threshold that a state comes in and pays for it.
So there you come again, education.
Which a lot of what you're talking about comes back to communication and information.
Mr. Councillor, I'm aware of the time. So, are there any final questions for Howard? No? Okay.
Thank you.
Very quick one, Leo.
I would venture worse.
Yeah.
In emergency management planning, where we do exercises and hypotheticals and things like that, the thing that just takes everything completely off the charts is a pandemic. Now, it depends so much on whether it's a pandemic that goes through at this level or whether it gets up to that. So this is not saying it will be, but all of these things on top of the fire and floods and the drought, you imagine any of those households, then they could be sailing through okay. It only takes even not necessarily a death, but a major illness. You think of the implications with casualised workforce, the implications on potential foreclosures, buildings a snowball. There are potential horror scenarios, or it could be like some other pandemics where we sail through. But the same principles still apply, yes.
Okay. Howard, thanks very much for taking the time again. We have a really good working relationship with Howard. So we'll certainly be continuing that over the coming weeks, and depends on how long they let him stay here from Tassie. So, yeah, very good. Okay, thanks, Howard.
No, that's the clicker. Hang on a second. Let me end the stream.
Very good.